Welcome to the ASHA Leadership Academy webinar, Change Leadership. This webinar content is appropriate for emerging and experienced leaders. I am Andrea Falzerano, Director of Association Governance Operations at the ASHA National Office. We planned today's webinar so audiologists and speech-language pathologists will gain awareness of their own style in encountering change, along with tools and strategies to enable successful change efforts. Each of you should have a copy of the handout, which includes speaker information and slides. If you do not have the handout, please pause the webinar now and access a copy from our website. You will need a copy for interactive sections of this presentation. At this time, I would like to welcome our presenters, Kevin Norse and Alice Wagen. Dr. Kevin Norse is an executive coach, organization development consultant, and facilitator with nearly 20 years of progressive experience in both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. He is a professional certified coach through the International Coach Federation and has extensive experience coaching leaders in the areas of emotional intelligence, career planning and transition, influence, risk-taking, and strategic thinking. Dr. Alice Wagen is a business consultant who teaches management skills to business leaders. Alice has conducted hundreds of workshops and training classes at many of the country's top Fortune 500 companies, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies in the Washington, D.C. area. In just the last 5 years, more than 132 leaders from 26 regional organizations have graduated from her unique leadership development workshop series. Now let's begin. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Andrea. We welcome everyone to the Leadership Academy webinar on Change Leadership. And we're happy and excited to have everybody participate, where we're going to be exploring change leadership and focus on providing some tools and techniques that you can use immediately as it relates to leading change. But first, I want to make sure I review our disclosure statement. I am Kevin Norse, principal of Norse Leadership Strategies, and I am an independent contractor. I am being financially compensated by ASHA for the Leadership Academy webinars, and I do not have any non-financial interests with ASHA. My colleague, Alice Wagen, is a subcontractor to Norse Leadership Strategies. She is also an independent contractor, financially compensated by ASHA for the Leadership Academy webinars, and without any non-financial interests with ASHA. We'll get into the agenda in just a moment, but I did want to point out the two audiences for our webinar today. We have participants in the classroom with us now, and then, of course, the larger audience of those of you listening on the recording. Throughout the webinar, there's going to be specific instances where there's a reflection question we'll share with everyone. And those that are on the recording, we would invite you to hit the pause button, reflect in your handout or in your journal on the question, and then replay or hit the start button to replay the webinar to join us. So with that, I'll toss to you, Alice, to get us going.
Well, thanks, Kevin. And I likewise want to welcome everyone to the webinar today. This topic of change and change leadership, I think, is so important to anyone who is in a leadership position today or who is aspiring to be in a leadership position. That said, let's take a look at how we're going to handle this topic today. There are libraries full of books on change and change leadership. What we've done here today is really selected some key highlights to share with you. We are going to be really kind of doing a flyover of the topic as opposed to a deep dive. We're going to start by having some key concepts defined, and then we have 3 specific content areas. First, we're going to have you do some awareness of your own style. Think about how you are handling change in a leadership role. Second, we're going to talk about what are the key competencies that are needed to be successful at leading change. And third, we're going to identify how to apply a framework to a change process that will give you more success. Now, before we jump into it, I just want to highlight one reason why this is really important to spend some time studying. There was a recent study by the American Psychological Association done in 2017 that came up with some pretty disturbing findings related to employee satisfaction, stress, and turnover as a result of poorly handled change. For example, nearly 1/3 of the respondents believed organizational leaders had a hidden agenda behind the changes they were implementing. Hidden agenda to me, it goes right hand in hand with a lack of trust. Really not a good thing for a leader to have. A large number of study participants suggested that they didn't trust their employers and were actively exploring leaving their jobs based on how changes were implemented. So lots of research, it goes into saying, there's serious business and organizational implications on change if it's handled poorly. And the opposite, if it's handled well, it's a great retention tool, really highlighting organizations people will want to stay with. So, Kevin, why don't you talk to us about some of these key concepts?
That sounds good, Alice. Thanks. So that we've got a common frame of reference, I want to define a couple terms. Specifically, we start with what is change leadership? Well, we look at that as really a role. So we step into a role of leading change, and it draws upon some specific skill sets such that you're able to guide an organization or a team through a change effort. So that role really does differ from a normal leader role in that we know that during times of change, people have very different needs in terms of working through the change, which points to our second definition of transition. So you might think about two concepts. Change is external events that happen that constitute change. But the inner experience of change is really what we call a transition. So it's the psychological process. And what we've done is highlight in the handout the general 6 stages that individuals go through when faced with change. And of course, this is based on some of the work, foundational work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who looked at death and dying in stages. And that research is still relevant even though it's 40 years old. Where we start with loss, we go through doubt, some level of discomfort. We hit kind of the bottom, and then we start to pull out of it in a discovery, understanding, and integration. So the premise is that as a change leader, it's being intimately aware of this model, not only for the people you're leading through change, but really your own process of navigating change, because sometimes that's just as important as what your followers are experiencing. So from that perspective, it's what are the tools and techniques that you as a change leader can use, as well as the key competencies you need to help people through this transition, which is a normal human reaction from that perspective. Alice, anything you want to underscore in our definition?
Well, I really appreciate you having the Kubler-Ross model here because I find it so valuable, and it's a part of change theory a lot of leaders ignore, and that's the emotional side of it. When you look at the left side, loss, doubt, discomfort, these are very natural, very normal, but not happy emotions. And oftentimes when I work with leaders going through change, they're like, well, what's wrong with people? Why are they grumpy? Well, because it's a part of it. You got to move people through this. So I think it's a great way for us to open this webinar.
That's great, thank you. So why is it important? Well, I think Alice highlighted one of the more recent findings in terms of research about why skills at leading change are so critical. But more specifically for CSD professionals, I mean, the nature of so many what audiologists and speech language pathologists are facing is organizational contexts that are going through a boatload of change, both in academic settings, educational, healthcare. So therefore, the ability to champion and effectively lead change, no matter what level you are in the organization, to me, it adds great value, not only to your patients or clients, but certainly the organization. But it's also, as Alice, you suggested, really indicative of someone that's on a leadership trajectory. Okay, so as is the case, we in every of the Leadership Academy webinars, we're going to explore research studies. So specifically, we think about some of the emerging themes when it comes to research. In this case, we've got a couple studies that are going on currently associated with leading change. One of them was around transformational leadership. And so, for example, we know that really effective transformational leaders can have a huge impact on the success of change. But there's also other aspects of change being incorporated into the research we know, such as change management, especially with software and technological implementations. So that's just a little flavor of what individuals are faced with, in terms of navigating change and what some of the research that's emerging on it are experiencing. So Alice, I think you're going to take us through a reflection question.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at it. As Kevin mentioned earlier, what we'd like is in a few minutes after I'm done setting this up, those of you who are listening to the webinar on demand, go ahead and hit pause and ponder this question a bit, make some notes for yourself, and then begin the recording again when you're done. For those of the folks that are live with us today, I'd ask you to put the answer to this in the chat box so we can have some other input. So here's our question. How do skilled leaders successfully lead change? Perhaps you might want to start by thinking about a change you've been through that really was, in your mind, very, very successful. What did the leaders do? Let's start to capture some behaviors here, some actions. So again, those of you on the recording, go ahead and hit pause. Well, Kevin, what's your thoughts on this? What have you seen in terms of successful change initiatives? What did leaders do?
I think by far what I notice is really effective change leaders are able to manage their own anxiety and change. In other words, be the leader you want others to aspire to. They model really powerful behavior. And I've seen that both in current clients. I heard stories about that even when I did research in New Orleans about Hurricane Katrina and how organizations handled it. And the stories I heard from leaders that really demonstrated powerful qualities in terms of self-management were huge.
That's a really good point, is being emotionally self-aware, acknowledging your own emotions before you're trying to deal with others. I think that's a really good input. The thing that comes to mind for me is this word, and I'm sure we'll be using it throughout our webinar today, is transparency, especially about transparency about what they cannot communicate. Oftentimes, if a change is, fairly significant to the business, there's things a leader can't share. And yet, rather than just letting the silence sit out there, they're open to say, I can't talk about that yet, but as soon as I can, I will. So I think that whole issue of transparency, especially about what can't be said, is important. So let's see what our live audience has to share with us. Mandy says, acknowledging staff fears and concerns. Yeah, put it out there. Rather than, again, let's be tough this out and not share it. Brianna mentioned skilled leaders successfully lead change by staying in constant communication. Yeah, again, we're going to talk about communication. Number one issue, I think. Yeah, and stages and changes for themselves and reflect on how the employees may feel. Absolutely. Maria mentions they present a unified front. Oh, that is so important. It drives me crazy when I hear people say, well, I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for the boss. That's a terrible, terrible message. And Nad says it's important for them to reassure the rest of the team, regardless of the change, that they're safe and secure and valued. Absolutely, yeah. The whole issue of personal safety and how people are going to weather through it is important. I think the other point that I'd like to just make here is, to be open and honest, because not everyone's going through at the same time. We have Kubler-Ross's model. It's not like everyone's marching through it at the same time. Some, might be more further along than others. And so to be aware, again, that emotional self-awareness, where are people and how can I lead them, as opposed to just kind of stifling that side of it. Kevin, any other thoughts on our reflection question?
No, I think a really good exploration here.
Okay, I think you're taking us next to our styles profile.
So, one of the first components of change leadership is knowledge of self. For those of you, some of you have taken the Leadership Academy Emotional Intelligence module, and really that's the essence of it. And associated with that is the idea of understanding your style of handling or navigating change. How do you personally tend to react to it? And so, what we presented is a very, very simple model that really gets at the essence of change styles or how you respond to change. And that everybody falls somewhere on the continuum. And in many cases, it may be dependent on the nature of the change, whether you chose it, whether it was surprised, whatever. So let me just explain. So what you'll find is on the left-hand side of the continuum would be those that go through change maybe more resistantly. They're more anchored in the present, the current reality, the way things are, maybe more skeptical of change and need to see much more proof of why we're doing something, and perhaps even fearful, certainly at first, when it comes to navigating change. Let's go to the other side of the continuum. That represents those individuals that are very, very supportive. And that may even be overly supportive, meaning they get adapt to change so quickly. It may not always serve them because there may be some instances when a little skepticism could be useful. Very oriented toward the future. It's what these individuals are often what we call early adopters. They're jumping on even what we might even call the bleeding edge of change, and it's exciting. It's filled with possibility. So as you could imagine, those are the two extremes, and it may be that I've seen, generally speaking, it's almost a bell-shaped curve that usually have most people in the middle. Alice, anything you want to add as it relates to our change profile?
Yeah, I'd like to maybe add another word to the far left-hand column, and that's cynical. I think a lot of times people, if they're in a high change environment that's not handled well, they may start at the right side, but when it's change after change, there's no communication, there's no rationale, there's no reason, they kind of get pushed to being resistant and skeptical, but also just sort of cynical, like, oh, this again, who cares? So I think that people can be moved on this depending on how well the change is led.
hmm So what's important is knowing your own style. If you tend to be one that's typically more resistant and skeptical of change, I think it's really important in terms of reflection. What are the implications for you and you're in a position to lead change? Or if you err more toward the other side, which is you're so highly embracive of change, again, what are the implications? Perhaps you may be overly ambitious about your change efforts and assume, which is easy to do, assume that everybody else is on board with it. So again, it's almost like one of the other webinars that we lead is on leadership styles, which really speaks about situationally adapting your style based on where your followers are. And I think that so directly speaks to the change styles profile and being aware and thinking about your own experiences of change, how you typically adapt to it, and generally speaking, what does the situation call forth in your organization? Is it be a little bit more skeptical and methodical, or is it really embrace it because it's a great opportunity and having some awareness? Yeah. So Alice, I think you're going to take us through a reflective question at this point.
Yes, I am. And again, let me do the setup. And after I'm done with the setup, I will ask the folks listening to the recording to pause and do their own analysis, and those who are with us live today to join in with their comments. So, where would you place yourself on the change style continuum? Thinking, sort of broadly about a number of changes in your life or the last few years. Where would you feel you most gravitate on this? And then the second part of that is, what are the implications of your change style on the way that you yourself would lead or guide changes in your organization? So first, where do you think is your comfort zone with change? And then second, what are the implications of that for you? Kevin, what's your thoughts on this for yourself or for others you've seen?
Well, I think as I reflected on this, Early in my life, I had a very impetuous, 3 sheets to the wind, let's go for it approach to change. And I find that, generally as I've aged, I've become a little bit more change cautious. Not in every case, but which I think is a natural part of the aging process. We know that we have more at stake. And that's, I think, why, recently I just relocated from the East Coast to the West Coast after 30 years in DC. And it was fascinating to notice my own experiences of change and, at midlife especially, the challenges and the opportunities that presents. But it was like one big experiment for myself in navigating change, and just fascinating. It was exhausting.
Wow, yes, you certainly have very recent experience in where you are in handling change, a major life change like that. Yeah. It's interesting when I was pondering this myself, and you alluded to this earlier. I think for me, if it's a self-imposed change, if it's one that I've elected to do, I am much more open to it than if it's one that is done to me or for me. And I think that again is just kind of human nature. I think if anything, I I gravitate probably sometimes too much in the I love change arena because I like things to change up quite a bit, and sometimes I think I'll push for change in my life just because I'm bored, and that may not be the best thing for others around me. So I think there definitely is implications in that.
Hmm.
So let's see what our other folks have shared with us. Mandy says, I think she's a 6 or so. Cautious person who has real excitement about progress. I really like to think things through before diving in. So, yeah, sort of in the middle, kind of ponder it before you
Stupid, how are you
jump
doing with
overboard.
that working out?
Brianna says, in regards to personal change, I find myself more resistant compared to professional change. That's
Huh.
interesting. Very, very interesting
Oh,
observation,
yeah.
Brianna, and it'll be interesting to kind of do some more thoughts on that. Nad says, I think my comfort zone varies depending on the situation. More flexible when leaders are
Yeah.
transparent and clear. Yeah, absolutely. More skeptical when it's imposed upon or unexplained and no answers. Yeah, yeah. It gets back to that study that I cited earlier, that when there's not a transparency there, it really can
Yay.
affect trust with the leaders and trust with the outcome. And definitely bespeaks to being as open as possible with change going forward. But it is an interesting thing that too little change, of course, is stagnation, but too much change is chaos. And so, where are we in the middle? And one of the things I often caution leaders about, if they're anticipating a lot of change, and oftentimes in the business world, one has no choice. Kevin, you cited technology. You have no choice. You have to
Yeah.
change and keep up to date on things. But I always like to tell leaders, figure out how to create a little oasis, a little break where things are stable, at least for a while, to give people an opportunity to catch their breath before you throw on the next change and the next change on top of it. Any other thoughts on our continuum here, Kevin?
Yeah, one way to think about this is that oftentimes I think the best way to implement change is in a team context, meaning you've got other colleagues that are helping you through the process. If, for example, you're on the wildly supportive, almost as we say, the bleeding edge of change, that you embrace it just for change's sake, if that's your style, perhaps you want to find others on
Thank
your
you.
kind
And
of
it's,
change
it is
guidance team or change
lovely.
leadership team that
Yeah,
have maybe a little bit
it is
more of a
something
conservative
really to
side
figure
or
out what they're
perspective toward
doing in
change
their
to balance it
background.
out. In other words, again, the value of
Very
teams
good.
is that we have a diversity of opinion or thought. And so again, knowing your style, finding those that maybe complement your style, because it really is not either or, but it's really both. You need people that are very supportive, willing to consider the opportunity, but you also need individuals that maintain stability. And so I think when it comes to comprising like a steering committee of change leaders, have that in mind when it goes to deciding who to involve in the effort.
That's a really good point. I think another corollary to this too is, have folks around you, reflect on this also, because if you tend to be resistant, find a colleague, like you said, a team member who embraces change and partner with them and have them help you see the beauty of change, and you help put the brakes on them, sort of counter each other.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I think I'm going to take it next, Allison. We'll talk a little bit about change competencies. So in this case, our really second major topic today is to break down this concept of change leadership competencies. What are the building blocks of skill needed to effectively lead change? So I'd like to introduce these, and then again, we'll have another reflection question to internalize what we're discussing here. So this is, again, based on some research that I've done and also working with leaders. It also roughly mirrors what I found in the U.S. federal government has defined change competencies for executives. And so I adapted that, again, based on experience I've had in other industries beyond federal government. So let me introduce each of these competencies and what they mean. We start first with, I like to start at the middle with resiliency. So a lot of my research in my doctoral program and then individual coaching I've been doing is how to build resiliency among leaders. The premise being that change leaders are resilient. They're able to not only cope with stressful times, but rebound from them. So any setbacks, resilient people generally will not get hung up in it. So we can think about the ability to, the definition of effective ways to cope with and learn from setbacks. So when you face roadblocks, you're able to circumvent them, find a way through them, and actually learn from them. That to me is really key. Secondly, let's talk about creativity. And so that involves the ability to create new approaches to problems, maybe challenging your assumptions that block creativity, and also encouraging innovation and creativity in others. And I think that's really important in organizations for leaders to be able to do that, because it's not just your own brilliance that you need to be worried about. It's, are you creating a culture that supports that? So there you are on a team together, and are you creating a supportive environment where people can be creative and innovative, or is it more of a fear-based environment where people are simply shutting down and going internal because it's not safe? So creativity needs safety, and that's to me a really important part of what good leaders do. Then we've got empathy. So the ability to read the temperature of a group and adapt strategies to their needs. I think harkening back to our initial slide where we looked at the stages of transition, really good change leaders are able to empathize and pick up on that subtlety to know where their audiences are. So it's really understanding your audience, and then perhaps when it comes to communicating, you craft your message to help people move through those stages, to find ways to engage them, get their input so they feel a part of the change. So that really speaks to the component of empathy. We then have flexibility, and that's remaining open and adaptable to new information options, as well as helping get rid of roadblocks, but doing that in a highly charged environment. Again, this links back to the concept of emotional intelligence, and it's all well and good to be flexible when times are stable. But boy, throw a little change in the mix, and suddenly it creates a lot of challenges. So a lot of times when people are stressed, they tend to want to control things. So flexibility is really key. It can make a huge difference in terms of the success of change efforts. I spoke about resiliency, strategic thinking. Again, we do have a separate webinar associated with that that goes into much more detail, but it's really looking at the opportunity to identify strategic opportunities and trends and translating those into plans and decisions. And so what we know is that leaders who are strategic thinkers can anticipate the need for change. So rather than being blindsided, it's, wait a minute, there's an emerging trend coming down the pike that's happening. So let's say changes in the Affordable Care Act, and we have got to do some thinking now to get ready for it, because that's the perfect world. Think about it. We've anticipated the need for change. It's not here yet, but we're starting to get our thinking aligned with that. And I find, generally speaking, change efforts that have that long leeway to get ready for it people tend to do better. I mean, I think about at the time of the Y2K crisis, I was a software developer. This was, 17 years ago in a former life. And it was just fascinating to look at those organizations that got on board and prepared for it versus those that waited until the last minute and literally to the final hour were still trying to get their systems updated. To me, that was a classic case of we know this potential landmine is coming down the road. Are we getting ready for it and thinking strategically about that? And then lastly, we've got vision. So that as a change leader, your ability to set a compelling vision about what the future looks like is such a huge determinant of people willingness to get on board with it and work through their transition process. And some people are skilled at this and others aren't, but it's a really important skill because I think it can galvanize people toward taking action and embracing the future state. Alice, that was a lot of competencies, and I know you have some thoughts. What do you think? You're thinking?
Well, I like the way you presented them, Kevin, and I like this whole concept of there being, 6 different competencies. I think sometimes when we look at change and people's effectiveness with change, thinking of change as a single set of behaviors, we miss the nuances. So, for instance, somebody can be a very empathic person, very good at reading the emotions of others and understanding, what's people's emotional state are and very caring and whatever, but they also might be very inflexible people. And so, you really need presence in all of these to be a good change leader. Or they may be highly flexible and resilient, but don't really have that ability to empathize with others. They're kind of the change leaders that are embracing change and running with it, and they're also very creative and whatever, but they're not. The followers aren't behind them because they haven't set the stage for bringing them along with them. So I think that what we have here is the complexity of change leadership. It's not just change; it's really thinking in terms of these other competencies along with it.
Great. So I think you're going to take us into a reflective question.
Yes, I certainly am. And again, let me set this up, and then folks can pause the recording or can type in the chat box their feelings about it. So our question, what change competencies would you most likely to develop or enhance? So this is a sort of a mini self-assessment looking at the 6 that we've already shared with you and its description. Where do you see you could be better? Where would you like to develop and enhance? And then the second part, what impact would it have on your ability to lead change? So self-assessment first, and then think about impact, because that's always a good thing to do when you're looking to develop. So go ahead and pause the recording now if you are listening to this as the webinar. Kevin, what's your thoughts on that? Where do you think you could do some growth areas for yourself?
I'm thinking about a current client I'm working with, a physician leader in a major medical center who's doing a lot of really innovative work around cancer support. And as I reflect on this individual, it seems to me that one of his big challenges is understanding his audience. In other words, he's a real visionary. So strategic thinking is a clear strength of his. He can go there. He can paint a very compelling future. However, what it means is that he loses people because he's so visionary. So for this individual, I would and have been coaching him in terms of developing more empathy to have better awareness about what people who have been doing these jobs, in this Cancer Institute over and over for years, so that they don't know what the vision is. And so his ability to empathize so he doesn't leave them behind, to me, that's really one of the areas we're focused on. How about you? What are you noticing among clients that you've noticed potential development needs?
Well, I think the one that I could highlight here is strategic thinking. I think oftentimes that leaders that I work with that are struggling with implementing change really aren't putting the change in the context of the system overall and where they're going with it. So we end up with that horrible phrase, unintended consequences. They're not thinking of the ancillary stakeholders, they're thinking of the core, but not placing that change in the context of everyone else. And I think that's an issue that really needs to be addressed. I think the other one, again, goes back to empathy. We don't talk a lot in the world of business about people's feelings. In fact, we tend to try to just look at the task side of the list. But understanding how the change really affects individuals, I think, is so critical and key. But I don't really see that attention paid to that very much. So let's see what our others have shared with us. Mandy says could grow in the creativity competencies. She feels she's good at planning and organizing, but would benefit to be able to think out of the box. Yeah, I think it's such a key component to successful change is to really be very bright and creative about the solutions that we're seeing. Maria says vision, flexibility, and creativity come easy, but be able to convey the benefits of the changes to, to bring the people along with you. I think that's the key issue of vision, and that is very, very important. Nat also says vision and creativity. It's easier to identify what there's a problem, when you need to change, when you get stuck. But to get perspective from someone outside the picture to help see things differently and more easily. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that these are really good reflections. And again, not just what to develop, but how much more successful you'd be if you developed in these areas, I think is the second part of it that's so important. Kevin, other thoughts you have about these competencies and how people can develop them?
Well, the other school of thought is in leadership development and the research and practice is really no one leader needs it all. In other words, that model of the great man or great woman who knows everything. And I think it's the same here as it is the change styles indicator. In other words, if you don't have a strength in one of these specific competencies, you could certainly develop it and have some, at least conceptual knowledge. But I think maybe the other alternative is to find colleagues who can augment your weaknesses when it comes to forming a change leadership team or a steering committee. Who are the creative thinkers that you can engage or enlist? Because you may certainly learn something from them, but it's a way to kind of move into action immediately. So again, it's always that question, does this really play to my strength? And if it doesn't, maybe there's someone else who's really good at it, who would love to be engaged. So I think to me, that gets back to that concept of, it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village many times to implement a change. And also really reflecting on what am I good at, and who could I choose to basically augment what I don't have. So it's a whole different way to think about development.
That's a really good point. Oftentimes I hear people say, embrace the change resistors because they slow things down and they cause us to question a lot of our actions and thoughts. And it can be that the change that we embrace so much and love isn't a good idea. and if you don't listen to the resistors and ponder what they're sharing, you may rush ahead with something that's not quite thought out. So I think that speaks very much to your point about it being more of a team sport than an individual sport to be effective at change. Good point.
Okay, I think at this point we'll explore the change framework, and then we'll alternate back and forth and explain what this means. So really our third major topic is thinking about the process of implementing change. And there's a number of models out there that really kind of can be almost represent a methodology or protocol for how you implement change. So John Cotter is a consultant and a researcher and a leadership researcher who's done an awful lot of writing about change and change leadership in the process for implementing change. And I know this is a model that ASHA embraces fully when it comes to implementing change, both organizationally and individually. So we'd like to unfold this model one step at a time. And as you're listening to this, take notes, but also pay attention. And we're going to be asking you, as you think about a change project you're involved with, some of the phases or steps here that may be relevant for you. So with that, I'll start off introducing, and then Alice, I'll toss to you. So really, step one, the idea of increasing urgency. And so when we talk about that, it gets back to this idea of, first, the importance of selling the problem versus the solution. So long before we get to the place of, here's this, exciting new change, have we done a very good job selling people on the current reality and why the current reality is untenable and unsustainable? And so when we increase the urgency, what we're trying to do is find data or evidence that's relevant to the stakeholders of our change to help them understand why it's so important to change. In other words, we use the term unfreezing people. What can we reveal to them that will help unfreeze them? Let me give you an example of that. I worked with another professional association, the executive director, and she was highly embracive of leadership and really struggling with fairly low membership numbers in her association. And she was shocked when she went to a conference with some of her members, and she overheard just, in the hallway between breaks, one member saying to another that, in essence, our association is a day late and $1 short on everything. And one of the worst fears, I think, of every association executive is to realize that they've become irrelevant for their members. So she was able to take that data and use that, in essence, to increase urgency with the board to create some changes in their organization, specifically service offerings to members, the website access, whatever. And so many times increasing urgency is about getting the voice of, quote, the customer in the room. And I've seen people do that creatively with video cameras, with interview data, with qualitative themes, those kinds of things. So in this case, it was very impactful in terms of unfreezing her board, that they were kind of locked into this belief that everything's good. So Alice, I think you're going to go next.
Thank you. That's a great example, by the way, Kevin. I love that. Get urgency by getting the voice of the member or the customer in the room. Absolutely. All right, our second step, now that you've increased the urgency, is to build the guiding team. Now, what do we mean by that? We're not talking about the project team or the people doing the work. We're talking about putting together a thoughtful team of individuals who will help guide the effort, in a sense, co-lead the effort to make sure that it happens. We've already mentioned this earlier about the importance of getting a team of people here, but the issue here is that who can you put on the team that's going to help you get the messages out as you go forward with this? So you might consider key stakeholders. You might consider other people who have a passion around this, who can help champion and support it. So that, again, you've got diversity of thought early on in the change effort to get it to go forward and to make sure that you're covering all the bases. So Kevin, you're going to talk about step 3 for us?
Sure will. So getting the vision right. So if you think about, again, one of the challenges I find that some change leaders make is they are so caught up in explaining how the change will happen, but they don't very clearly compel or communicate the end result they're trying to create. And so by getting the vision right, again, it would be, for example, drawing upon your guiding team to help shape that vision, where you can paint a very positive, powerful image of what the future state will be. I think, I think, oftentimes in the leadership development program, we'll cite the I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As one amazing, compelling vision, how he could regalvanize the social justice movement. Now, not everybody needs to be able to speak like Dr. King. However, the elements of his speech were a really good demonstration of getting the vision right and understanding. And again, we're drawing upon that empathy competency. Where are people's hearts and minds? And what do I need to say? And how do I need to say it in ways that helps them see themselves in the future and create some sense of excitement? Because a vision isn't just a cognitive thing. If it doesn't excite people, maybe even scare them a little bit, then it's probably not worth much. So again, getting the vision right. So Alice, you're next up.
Well, step 4 is the corollary of getting the vision right. It's communicating it. And again, we've spoken a lot in this time together today about the importance of communication, but I'd like you to focus on the last part of this, for buy-in. We're not just dumping data on people. We're not just saying, here we are in the change, get with it. What we're trying to do here in this step is, again, to watch where everybody is with the messages thus far. What is their emotional state? Where are they on the Kubler-Ross model? Are they, in anger and fear? That's a different communication than I'd have with them if they were in acceptance and moving on. So a good change leader sees in step 4 what kind of communication needs to happen to make sure there's buy-in from everyone at all levels. Kevin, step 5?
Okay, so one of the reasons we know people resist change is because it will make them feel incompetent. Think about it. Your organization's implementing maybe a new intake protocol or implementing a new best practice. So you're taking people from what they don't know to what perhaps they need to learn. And so empowering action is often about giving people the skills and the knowledge to be able to function in the new environment. And that many times they will resist because, again, adults do not like to feel incompetent or uncertain. And so if you don't provide training, to me, that's really going to shoot a change effort in the foot. So you're providing them what is it they need to know and how do they need to function in this new to-be environment, making sure that, part of selling the case for change is also, and we're going to support you in terms of help you be skillful and successful in this new environment. So back to you, Al.
All righty. Well, create short-term wins. I think this is even more important with large change efforts that are going to span months, sometimes even years, is to segment the work into phases or steps that can be celebrated as they're achieved. Again, this is another thing that I see often overlooked is leaders are so much with their eye on the end goal that they don't give people the rewards of interim success. There was another research similar to this a number of years ago. People by the name of Teresa Amabile and Stephen Kramer wrote a book called The Progress Principle. It's not cited in your bibliography because it really was a book focused on employee motivation and engagement. But they came to the same conclusion as we have here in step 6, is short-term wins really give people the motivation to continue. Where if there is day after day, week after week, month after month, no sense of achieving anything, it really does break down motivation and engagement. So this gets back to really kind of planning the change. Are there moments where we can say we're not there yet, but we've made real headway? That's what's important here. So Kevin?
Just underscoring that, I've worked in, for example, healthcare systems that have started using lean daily management in a way of building in more quality into their organization. And for example, a really smart way to do it is to start with a little pilot. We're going to do lean daily management in this particular clinical department. And after 60 days, we're going to report kind of what we discovered. Again, that's a really great way to create short-term wins. Small pilots or prototypes where you can prove the concept and demonstrate that it really does add value. And then take that and sell it. Because again, in most cases, you don't have the luxury to take 2 years to create value. It's got to be immediate. Okay, so the step 7, don't let up. And so the issue is that a lot of times change fails not because it wasn't communicated successfully, but because people lost interest, or they got conflicting messages and priorities, or the organization starts to implement new changes, and then people kind of burn out. And so I think it's really critical, which is why going back to making sure your guiding team understands this. But don't let up means let's really stay focused on this and drive toward completion. Otherwise, people do get conflicting messages and won't sustain it. So I think it really is about focus and prioritization. Okay, and then the last one now.
Yes, make change stick. One of the most frustrating things I have seen organizations go through is implementing a change, and within a certain length of time, days, weeks, or months, people gravitate back to the old way. And that is very frustrating for everybody, and it makes future change become even more difficult because the resistors get the message, well, if we just ignore it, it'll all go away. So what happens in step 8 is you need to take a step back and get a broader view of the world around the change to see if there's other ancillary changes that need to happen to make the change permanent and stick. For example, I worked with a client a number of years ago, a consulting firm that wanted to move away from a traditional hierarchy into a more team-based culture. And so they went through a very lengthy process over the months of getting people more assigned to teams than an individual boss or bosses. And I won't go through the whole thing, but at the end of the day, what they had failed to do was change their performance management system. So people were still being measured and rewarded on the old way of life. So needless to say, the team-based culture was in name only, but people still operated in a hierarchical fashion. So to take and really look at the context and the systems, the stakeholders, the customers, the members, all the world surrounding the change, and say, do we have to make other smaller changes to make this thing really cement into place? So Kevin, I think you've got a reflection that we'll take on this.
That's right. So let's tie this together. So here's what we suggest is reflect on a change project you're familiar with in your role. This could be something that's happening now. It could have been something that happened in the past. And so the question is, which of the 8 change steps from the Cotter model would have had the greatest impact on the project if it wasn't as successful as it could have been? So as you're scanning down the list of steps, which maybe weren't used that really could have and had a very strong impact. Okay, so we'll take a chance and apply the model. For those listening on the recording, if you want to hit the pause button, do some reflection, and then when you're ready to rejoin us, hit the replay button and we'll debrief. So Alice, as you think about some of your clients in this framework, do any stand out in terms of things that they could have done to make it more successful?
I think in many cases of the organizational leaders I've worked with don't do as good a job on that first step of increased urgency. And I think it has to do, going back to our competency model, that the empathy or being able to see the world from other people's point of view. So in other words, what organizational leaders are exposed to is, a lot of numbers and facts and data that may not be part and parcel of the rest of the organization. So they've, created their own sense of urgency in their own mind and in the minds of their team, but they don't really know how to translate that or do a good job translating that down to the entry-level people, the shop floor people, and get them to understand those numbers and why the change is so critical. What about you, Kevin?
Well, what I've noticed is that a lot of the leaders and organizations I've worked with, by the time change happens, they are already on board with it. So they're communicating the wrong message to the audiences, the stakeholder audiences, which is imagine this, amazing new future, and you've got staff that are thinking, well, I thought everything was working pretty well. In other words, there's a mismatch between where the executives who are communicating the change, they're already on the upside, the upswing of the transition model in terms of like the generative, kind of visionary perspective. But staff are still in this doubtful, wait a minute, why are we changing? So I think that mismatch between follower and leader is huge. So let's take a look and see what our classroom participants have shared. Mandy reflected on a long and frustrating process, which is very familiar. So for that project, communicating the information they cared about and what was important to them. So that idea of communication again, being clear on the communication. Maria, you talk about creating short-term wins, building momentum and buy-in. Yeah, and that's a great place to recognize people who are stepping up, and so you're really reinforcing this new model associated with it. Yeah, so those are some really good sharings in terms of application to the model. And like I say, this is a very rich model. There's a lot to it, and it would be a really good follow-up read. We have some reference information in the bibliography associated with Cotter's work. Any last thoughts, Alice, before we tie it together?
Well, actually, Kevin, your talking reminded me of a situation I was in a number of years ago. I was working with a senior team. The organization was going through a big change effort, and the senior team was very frustrated by the level of resistance they were getting from the staff. And I listened to them complain for a minute, and then I said to them, I would like you to think back. When did you first realize this change had to occur? And they said 6-8 months ago when the market data showed this or that. I said, okay, stop right there. When did you tell the staff this change was going to occur? Last week. I'm like, okay, do you see the issue here? And you're so right. Senior leaders live with this a lot longer as it rolls out, and their inability to understand that the folks that were resisting were just starting down that road, where these folks have been down it for more than 6 months.
Yeah. Great example.
All right. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and take a look at where we've been today. To be a good change leader, you have to understand your own style, where you are in a comfort zone with change or not. You also need to understand that there's a wealth of competencies, 6 that we presented to you today, that you need to also do a self-assessment on to see where you are. And lastly, the Cotter's model is really a gold standard, I think, for change. Take a look at those steps the next time that you are going to initiate a change, and really take them to heart and run the change by them. All right, we always like to, in these webinars, give you a further thought and further actions. And so what's next? Interview 2 experienced leaders you respect and ask them how they lead change. What are their tips they can share with you? And then put the mirror on yourself when you're going through a life change. What is happening to you? What is happening to you emotionally? What's happening to you physically? How are you adapting to it? And then again, observe others. We're really big on observations here. I think it's a great way to learn new ideas. So with that, Andrea, I'd like to turn the mic over to you to wrap us up
Thank you,
today.
Kevin and Alice, and thank you everyone for joining us. This webinar is part of a series in ASHA's Leadership Academy. For more information, including information on continuing education credits, visit www.asha.org and search Leadership Academy. We also encourage you to join the ASHA community focused on leadership topics. Go to asha.org and search Leadership Academy. You will find a link to the online community on this page. This concludes the ASHA Leadership Academy webinar on change leadership. Goodbye from the ASHA National Office.
We have a bunch of samples that we can pull from. We had guidance, but it was just a good guidance. policies. So what we've got to do